Good afternoon, everyone. It's Helen Daly-Fisher back from the Equality Rights Alliance. I'm coming to you once again from the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people here in the ACT, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. For those who may need a visual cue, I am a white middle-aged woman wearing a floral dress and glasses with a brunette bob. My pronouns are she and her. So we are into our second session of our CSW68 debrief and report back. For those of you who have joined us for the first time today, we had a session this morning where we went through the agreed conclusions and the general themes that we noticed across CSW. And that was a really sort of useful opportunity for us to try and pull some stuff together. We've recorded that session, so that's going to be made available, and you'll be able to see that from a link on the ERA website. For people who are watching this subsequently and who would like to find that earlier session, the ERA website is www.equalityrightsalliance.org.au. The other thing to note is that this is a week in which we've been doing a lot of these sessions. We've also done one on CEDAW earlier this week. So if the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is of interest to you, then you can get the basics on how to engage with it from that training session, which will also be on the ERA website. In this session, what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at how to apply the agreed conclusions to your work. And then what are some of the international processes coming up, both CSW and others, that we may want to either get involved in or just be aware of and monitoring. And then we'll move on to what we're going to do for next steps. So a quick recap on where we were this morning. Some of the key themes that we noted when we were in that session this morning. I'm just going to pop the slides up so we can have a look at those. I'm going to go back just a little bit. We're going to flick past a couple of the key themes. So things that we saw were leadership and decision-making of women and girls. I'm just going to spotlight myself so we have fewer people. Good. Climate change and poverty came up strongly. We noted that there was an education discussion, but that higher education was missing from it. Underpaid and undervalued work, or not valued work. Gender-based violence and some particular squeamishness around intimate partner violence language. And although generally a bit of a across-the-board agreement that that's a key issue. The role of business and the role of men and boys. AI design and the weaponizing of data against women and girls. Gendering public policy and budgets, and how that's moved from being a niche issue to being something that's generally accepted and not controversial. Intersectional discrimination and the reluctance to put text about intersectional discrimination into the agreed conclusions. Sovereign and public debt still remaining a highly contentious issue, with a real gap between global north and global south opening up over that issue. Concerns about the Green Climate Fund versus the World Bank, and working with the World Bank around what loss and damages and climate preparation funding looks like, and the use of debt in that space. Women's access to finance and land came up strongly. And then one big thing that came through was the under-resourcing of work on gender equality. So no poor solutions for poor women. And that covers everything from the redistribution of unpaid work, covering decent work, equal pay for work of equal value, and a really strong theme around social protections and a good showing for language around publicly funded services in the agreed conclusions. Then there was another piece around feminist infrastructure, and that's the quote that came up in the 5 p.m. briefings: fund women's organisations like you want them to succeed. I love that line. And protect women human rights defenders. And just noting that we did lose some of the language around women human rights defenders, particularly some of the specificity around the different types of defenders who need protection and who need resourcing. And then some of the other themes we noticed were the big theme around women in occupied territories and militarisation, the pushback on human rights, funding women's organisations, as we said just then, the sex and gender piece around trans inclusion, guiding principles on business and human rights starting to be an accepted part of the landscape, the UN liquidity crisis and the pushback on UN processes, which we all experienced firsthand. And then that last moment about having reservations on the text from Nigeria, where we had a moment where we thought we might not get agreed conclusions. And that that entire moment standing in as a symbol of that broader push against UN processes that we're seeing generally. So we then had a chat about the agreed conclusions, and you can have a look, as I was saying, at the video about those. But that brings us now to, we'll just skip through the agreed conclusions ones, to a discussion about what it is that we do now that we've got these agreed conclusions sitting in front of us, despite the best efforts of Nigeria, and how it is that we can use this in our work, both domestically and how we can engage in other international processes. Now, one thing I want to say is that I know very well that everybody in this space is absolutely flat out. Nobody has capacity to do any more work. So the question I've got is how we can make these opportunities a way of simplifying some of the things you do, or of being an add-on that doesn't impose too much on you. So if you've got concerns or questions about any of that, or in fact anything that I'm talking about, do feel free to either drop a question in the chat, or feel free to just come off mute and shout out if you want to interrupt, because this is going to be fairly free-flowing. A word of warning, I am looking at just dropping in on some of you and saying, what do you think about this? Because I know that some of you are already doing some work in these spaces. And so it's really useful for us to be able to pool our understanding about what's happening there. So a couple of things that I would say when we're talking about how you bring it home, what it looks like, is that it's important to remember that the agreed conclusions themselves are not, firstly, the only thing you would bring home from CSW. So many of you will have been to events that have made light bulbs go off in your head, or have opened your eyes to the existence of programs that would be useful to be rolled out in Australia, or techniques that could be used here. And so it's really important to remember that I'm a bit of a language nerd. And consequently, which will surprise none of you, and consequently, I tend to focus a little bit on the agreed conclusions, but it's just as important and just as valid for you to be focusing entirely on what it was that you brought out of running your own events, or having seen events that have sparked something for you, or provided you with information. So there's a whole realm of how to use what you got from CSW that doesn't touch the agreed conclusions. We will focus mainly on the agreed conclusions, though, partly because it's my webinar, but also because it's actually the slightly trickier thing to do, because it's very difficult to look at the language that's in the agreed conclusions and make a direct connection to what's happening for you on the ground here in Australia. So when you're looking at the agreed conclusions, it's important to remember that you don't read this document in a linear fashion. It's a good idea to skim through it once, and I do mean skim through, like look at each paragraph and go, oh, that one's about that, oh, that one's about that, and just get a sense for the structure of it. And just as a quick reminder for those who didn't get too deeply involved in the language stuff this go around, the document's broken into 3 bits. There's the preambular paragraphs, the operative paragraphs, and then the tail paragraphs. And the preambular paragraphs set out the details of the issue, of the priority theme, and the way the Commission sees that issue, and then references the other surrounding architecture of UN agreements and documents and technical papers that form the background in which people are expected to interpret what's in the agreed conclusions. That's why we fight so hard to get those documents mentioned. So we like to have a reference to the ILO conventions, and we like to have a reference to the Declaration on Indigenous Rights. And so those documents and that first preambular paragraph bit is the first place for you to have a look at. So once you've worked out, and this step is the sort of thing you do every day, what your key areas of interest are, what it is that your advocacy focus is going to be, let's say for the next 12 months, then the first thing to do is to have a little look in those preambular paragraphs and to say, all right, what are the sort of key international documents that I'm being directed to in the paragraphs that line up with the sort of things that I'm talking about in Australia? And it's worth remembering, of course, that they're going to be phrased differently to the way you're used to be seeing them. So if you're doing something on housing affordability in Australia, you might very well be looking at a preambular paragraph that talks about issues that aren't quite the same, but have the same root causes. So the right to own land, for example, or access to finance, or references to slum clearance and similar other international manifestations of housing crisis can then be brought home to Australia, because ultimately what they're talking about is having access to the levers for either affordable home availability or even home ownership. So start in those preambular paragraphs and have a look at which international documents are you being pointed to in each thematic paragraph there. And that can be a way of finding out what it is that you're supposed to be looking at. So for instance, when we were looking at the Zero draft this year, we had Deb from Sisters Inside participating in our language group. I was directed to a series of documents, the Rome Rules around prisoners, which I'd never seen before, because Deb said that they should be referenced in the preambular paragraphs. Now, unfortunately, we didn't get them in, but that was the first time I'd seen those rules. And they turn out to be a codification of a few things that cut across a number of our areas of work, particularly around welfare and around public participation and the right to vote. And so you can find some really good headline level, but all-encompassing material around your areas by looking at those international documents that are referenced in the preambular paragraphs. So that's the first thing to think about. The second thing to think about is the operative paragraphs, because they're the things that states have agreed to do. Although while you're looking at the preambular paragraphs, just going back a step for a moment, also keep an eye on what's missing. What is it that if you were writing a document about poverty and gender equality, what would you have put in that didn't make it in? Because that's an important thing for us to know, because these themes do tend to sort of cycle around in slightly different forms. And it may be important for us to have that under our belt for next time, because it might be something we need to get in. So look at the preambular paragraphs to see what your resources are internationally on your subjects, and whether or not they've articulated the priority theme the way you would have. The second thing that you can do is go to the operative paragraphs, and they're the ones that have letters in front of them instead of numbers. So in this one, I think it's like the first 50 paragraphs are preambular paragraphs, and then paragraph 51 says that states and a whole lot of other parties agree to : A. And then we go down a whole series of paragraphs which are about what states are actually committing to undertake to achieve gender equality in relation to the priority theme. And that section is where Australia has agreed to do things. We've agreed to do everything that's under that unless we express a reservation. And I'm not aware that we expressed any reservations. So if it's in the agreed conclusions, Australia said they would do it. And so that's something for you to start bringing home, because that's something that we actually don't do well at the moment here in Australia. We negotiate the agreed conclusions, and then they fall into a black hole and are never heard from again until I want to know whether some obscure phrase has been used before. And so that's something that we need to change. We need a new system for being able to keep Australia to account for the things that they agree internationally. So the way to do that is to go back to what it is that is your advocacy priority or your research priority, and then to step out a little bit from the specificity of what it is that you want to achieve and ask yourself, what are the enabling or environmental conditions that are required that need to be overcome or that need to be achieved in order to achieve the advocacy or research outcome you have. So, for example, if it's housing, we might be looking at, well, there's a whole piece around economic security, a whole piece around poverty, a piece around housing being sustainable in the face of climate change. And so there's a whole range of extra issues, surrounding issues around the core priority that you have. And knowing those and having articulated those to yourself then helps you to look at both the preambular paragraphs and more particularly the operative paragraphs and say, all right, are there any paragraphs that talk about my issue? And this is where find and search is really helpful. So try the terminology that you use. If that doesn't work, do a bit of Googling and work out whether there's other terminology that's used internationally, and try Googling that or try searching for that in the document. The next step around that, though, is to identify that enabling environment or those conditions that are required, and also the relevant human rights that apply to the area for you. So if I'm talking housing again, I'm talking about the right under ISCA, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. You can tell it's the second session of the day. Which is the article about an adequate standard of living, which contains an implied and partly articulated right to affordable and appropriate housing. So I would be looking not just for references to housing in the Agreed Conclusions, and I have to say, if I was looking for housing, I'd be sadly disappointed, even though it's about poverty. But I might be looking for language about infrastructure or about public services, because I might be looking for public housing. And so rather than looking just for the little thing that I want to look for, the housing piece, I'm looking for the sort of language that buttresses my ask in advocacy. So I'm looking for any references to the right to an adequate standard of living, particularly if they mention housing, but even if they don't, going broader. I'm looking for what Australia has committed to do to alleviate the types of poverty and the economic barriers that tend to lead to women being in housing stress or homeless. And so that broader language is the key to being able to find a place for your issue within the Agreed Conclusions. So it requires a little bit of creativity. You do need to be using the find function. My recommendation is that you do focus, particularly if you're in advocacy, that you focus on the operative paragraphs because they are what states have agreed to do. And that you are quite broad in your searching not just for your specific issue, but for the surrounding enabling factors, things that Australia is committed to do that would be helpful on your path to achieving your advocacy outcome. If you're in research, you might find that the preambular paragraphs are actually very useful too, because what they do is they set out priorities. And in particular, where that's useful is being able to say to Australia, you identified my proposed research area as an area that was of critical importance to gender equality in the preambular paragraphs of CSW68's Agreed Conclusions. So that makes my funding proposal extremely timely for you. So that sort of approach is what we're looking at when we're looking at either research or advocacy. So once you've identified Australia's commitments and worked out which ones best align with your advocacy, the best thing you can do is a bit of mapping. So map what it is that Australia has agreed to do against your work and particularly against the recommendations you're making. So what you want to be able to say if you're doing advocacy to government is, you said you would do this thing. I have the answer for how you can do it. Here's my recommendation. And that's the basic thrust of it. The The other approach is to go broader. And I would recommend, if you have the ability to do this, to move out beyond just the agreed conclusions. It's rather useful, particularly in Australia, where we have a poor engagement with processes like the Sustainable Development Goals, to be able to say, you said you would do this in 3 agreed conclusions, and you said that you would do this under the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a recommendation from the CSOs committee that you do this. And so here's my proposed solution to this problem that you're in. And so that's a rough sense of where we get to on straightforward advocacy or research in this area. I'll just pause there and ask, are there any questions or anything anyone wants to raise? Any experiences anyone's had of doing this? You can just come off mute and shout.
Helen, I'd like to share.
Please do.
So in my multiple hats in some ways, so at the university, we have a director of gender equity. So basically, she's really, really keen on the outcomes and experiences of CSW, of my experiences, but also on a general basis. So basically, we have a gender equity advisory group at the university that's under the governance structure. It sits under diversity, inclusion, and belonging and equity at the university. So I chair that diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So that's good. But gender equity sits under that. And Dr. Samantha Owen, Associate Professor Samantha Owen, is leading that space. And she's really interested. So in that respect, I'll be presenting to the advisory group in a few weeks with respect to my experiences of CSW, but the outcomes document. But then in my AGW, Australian Graduate Women hat, the focus is very much on higher education of women. Yeah. So moving beyond high school education to tertiary education. So that could be TAFE, higher education, etc., doctoral education of women, and the translation of that into the workforce. So under that, we also partner with our sister national federations, sister NFAs in Canada, in United States, in various parts of the world. So what work and how we could actually take this space further, because it's challenging. So for example, our sister organization in Canada is very much focusing on Afghanistan, and they would like other NFAs to support them with education at all levels of girls and women in Afghanistan, and look at what models could work in some ways, And then being on the Committee of Women in Global Health, they're also interested in global health leadership and gender in that way. So again, it is like health workers, but health leadership also. But one of the challenges that I have, and Shirley and I have discussed it, and Dalma, who was strongly associated with economic security for women, as a hat, is a lot of the language in the outcomes document doesn't put the onus on who is accountable to actually undertake anything that happens. So the language can be lukewarm, is very lukewarm in that respect. So who holds countries accountable, or who holds international organizations accountable, is very unclear. And you've mentioned this on several occasions, like we're really not doing well, say in gender pay gap. We're not doing well with homelessness. We're not doing well in our country, so in Australia, with violence against women, and especially violence against women in the Indigenous space and in the migrant space. So in all of that, we are not doing very well. And how do we look at our commitments in Australia in meeting those commitments? So in my research hat, I'm really committed to violence against women. So that's the research that I'm undertaking at the moment. And one of the things is how challenging that space is across the board for all women to navigate. And you continue to have loss of children or loss of lives, women who lose their lives, in this space. So these were few of the reflections. What I'm doing is I'm also going to have, like you, a PowerPoint presentation when I present, and I'd be happy to share that with you all. Right. So that whoever wants can use that. So my first one is on the 22nd or 23rd of May with the Public Health Association of Australia, focusing a lot on the related health aspects and gender and health aspects with the International Health Special Interests Group. So then Australian graduate women will present to that, but there the focus again is on higher education of women. And it'll be interesting to see, what happens in that space, because we have the new Accord review that has come out that is focusing on higher education of priority groups in Australia. So there are lots of pieces that somebody needs to hold our government to account in terms of what could be related in this document with some of the commitments that they have sort of made. They've made the commitment to violence against women. They've made the commitment to participation of priority groups in higher education. They've made the commitment but there's a new migration review out and migration policy that will change migration patterns in Australia. So there's a lot that is there, but I am challenged, really challenged, is how do we actually have that? And this accountability piece. And I feel more challenged because I'm always based in Perth, so I can't go anywhere easily. Unless, it's expensive. So I have to plan, like if I can't, so I can write a media statement, an advocacy statement, and a position piece or whatever it is, but it becomes more difficult to actually, that accountability is challenging. And you see my problem is that every 3 or 4 years, like funding for the women's alliances, like that funding is just not enough, just not enough in terms of also having a good number of people who will work on a sustained basis. So, you don't have to re-tender again and again every 3 or 4 years, but that for 10 years you'll be funded. It's notional funding for 10 years, and every 3 years you just give a really detailed report or something. So it allows you to think strategically in a focused manner, and at the same time employ people at the right remuneration rates. That's the other challenge that is a problem also. So I'll pause here, Helen.
That's brilliant, because I'm frantically making notes about all the things you just raised, Jaya, because I think there are 4 key different things you've raised there. So let me just quickly recap on those, because they're really good. Thank you. That piece around what if you're not sitting, or what happens beyond advocacy or research in terms of the role of reporting to others. So just increasing the general recognition and awareness that CSW actually happens. And I like to refer to CSW as the biggest feminist event you've never heard of, because for most people, they've never heard of it. So every one of us has a role here, I think, in terms of bringing it home to roll out to our networks a base level of understanding about what CSW is, what it does, what comes out of it, and why it's important. And we can actually provide some materials around that if that's useful to people. So we have, sort of the training materials and that sort of thing that we've used in the past around CSW. We could sort of put together a quick explainer, which is a 1-pager that could form the basis of reports back. So even just quite simple ones, not like yours, Jaya, but ones that are just out to memberships, for example, so that somebody who's participating in CSW for the first time can come back with some resources about how to, about why it mattered and what needs to be done next. The next thing that you've raised is engaging in international networks. You were talking about your different hats, and in particular your international hat, and the importance of making contact if you have access to an international network, because you're with an organisation that has a parent body or a network or some sort of convening mechanism, of reaching out to the other people in that network who are doing work in this space. Because one of the things that really does work, particularly with Australia for some reason, is peer pressure. So who else in other countries is implementing this stuff, and who's doing it well, and who in your networks can simply tell you about that rather than you having to go and find out about it. So those international networks are really important in terms of being able to understand where Australia sits in terms of their implementation, because we often think we're a lot better than we actually are when we're compared with other comparator states. And then the other strength of international networks, and I think we might try and talk to Ludmilla and Lee about this a little bit later on too, is of being able to then plan future work in relation to CSW and being able to make sure that your advocacy is both aligned and networked with what's happening in Australia, but also with your partners overseas, and then being able to bring that into our planning within Australia, which is incredibly valuable, particularly around expertise. The third one was the question about implementing outside government, and I love that one. So there'll be plenty of people, and I'm doing a debrief for the Champions of Change Alliance in a couple of weeks. For them, the discussion will be about how do you bring it home into your organisation? And plenty of people in our network of NGOs will also be in organisations that have a function where they're not obliged to implement under the agreed conclusions, but they could. Or it may be that the agreed conclusions make reference to, for example, a sustainable development goal, which is applicable to their work. And so having a think about whether or not there is a role for your organisation or for organisations you're allied with to actually implement themselves. Something else I would encourage you to think about is which level of government are we talking about? Because federal government, the Office for Women knows what they've committed to. DFAT's got a pretty good idea. They were involved too. Attorney General's Department might get their head around it at some point. Other departments will be sent a brief, and that brief will tell those departments what it is that came out of the agreed conclusions. And that's pretty much it. There's a discussion every time they go to prepare their position for the next CSW. And I believe that sometimes there's a bit of a discussion about whether or not implementation happened at the last agreed conclusions, but it's not clear and it's not consistent. And I certainly don't have any transparent understanding of what's happening in terms of reporting back from those departments. So that's as good as it gets. And then I have no idea whether state governments have any idea what's in the agreed conclusions, let alone local government. So thinking about what your role might be in terms of raising it, if you're someone who speaks to local government or speaks to state government or speaks to other stakeholders, so for instance, health bodies, where you might be able to raise what's in the agreed conclusions, that can only be useful in terms of improving the overall understanding of what it is we're supposed to be doing. It would also be useful in terms of some of the domestic work that's coming up that we'll talk about towards the end of this session around human rights in Australia. So keep that in mind. And the final piece that, Jaya, that you've raised there is around accountability. And who is doing the watching. And as I say there, it's really not clear sort of what mechanisms exist within government. And I suspect that there are no formal mechanisms within government for this. It's interesting to have a quick look at the Attorney General's website, where in relation to some treaty obligations, they have a reporting mechanism with traffic lights, where they say they list all the recommendations that have been made under the various treaties that the Attorney General's Department is responsible for, and they keep track of when things have been implemented. And so you get a red for not done yet, an orange for, yeah, done a bit, and a green for, yep, we've ticked that box. Often we think they're greens or oranges, but at least somebody's watching. We don't have that for CSW or for CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So that I think is a critical piece, and part of what I'm hoping people will do by continually raising the obligations in their work is that government will eventually start to hear this over and over again and begin to think, this is something we might actually have to pay attention to. It's not unless we're raising it that they'll think they have to do it. And so there is no trigger mechanism within Australia for this stuff to be done. The trigger mechanism internationally is supposed to be the report back on the review theme at CSW, but as you would have seen from this year's CSW, the review theme tends to get kicked to the curb really quickly because the priority themes are so vast that all the time is needed to deal with that. So we end up with ministerial statements that are all about how fabulous it is that Ireland has got 9 weeks of paid parental leave. Woo! Whereas, there's no actual sort of accounting against any standard, no external scrutiny that takes place at CSW or in any other function. So it's up to us to be raising this, basically, in order to start to create a sense that that the government needs to be doing something, and that's all levels of government. The other thing, I guess, that came out of that, jail was the missing infrastructure within Australia. So the underfunding of structures like the alliances, the fact that none of the alliances are responsible for the international engagement. And to be frank, ERA has always done it just because I'm in the job. And that's not entirely true. It's partly because I'm in the job and partly because prior to me, Caroline Lambert was in the executive director role at YWCA Australia. We both had experience in this area. We both know a little bit about the international processes, and we both built into that in this.
And you were also committed. Like
committed
you all went beyond and over your roles and your times. So there was a commitment to all of us. Like you didn't have to do that, but to bring us together, to share the information. It's huge, you know. You could have done only like go there and, you know, be passionate about the language part that you were and help and support with that. But you went beyond, you know, because of your interest. And I think that gets missed in many ways.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I would say, yeah, certainly don't regret doing that because the process is important and you guys are fabulous, but it's not a sustainable model. You can't have a model like that relies on happening to find people who can do it and are committed to it. So we do need something in Australia that is a dedicated place for us to build capacity, to assist and resource engagement, and to then do that monitoring piece to a certain extent, or to help others to do it. Yeah, look, there's a place for that, you know, sitting not just in the women's equality space, gender equality space, but, you know, further out as well. Australia doesn't have good mechanisms for this across the entire human rights process. So let's come back to that one when we talk about the domestic stuff later on. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to raise? I noticed we've got a couple of comments in the chat. Cool. Nothing there that we need to go to at this point. All right. So I'm going to move us on a little bit then. We're doing beautifully on time. So other ways that you can look at the bringing it home piece, and we've talked about some of this, and Jay, you've given a lovely practical demonstration of some of these. But setting up a watching brief on a particular issue is something that's particularly useful when you're engaging in this broader networked approach to CSW from Australia. So being able to say at the beginning of the CSW process back in September each year, I'm the person who looks at blah. You don't have to be an expert. We're happy to support you to do that. But if that's something where you've got a specific area of focus and you want that to be your area of focus, this is the time to start looking at the language in these agreed conclusions about that focus, and maybe make some notes about what's in, what you want to keep, and what you want to lose, and what's not in. And once you've got those, you've got your first piece of previously agreed language commentary for next time. And the reason why it's important to do that now, and why Maddie and I are madly working on a very large report on the language, is because we're about to come up to a review year, which means it's going to be 2 years before we pick up the language again for the agreed conclusion negotiations. And we forget in that period. We always end up reinventing the wheel at the beginning of the process. So if there's an area where you think there was something seriously missing, and you know, I would, for example, really love to see something about women in prison and about criminal law in some of the agreed conclusions language. So we'd be looking to find an expert who might be prepared to step into that space. We had really great support this year from Project Respect in the ERA membership on the issue of trafficking, which was really valuable to just be able to reach out to someone and say, this is the paragraph, I've cut it out and stuck it here. What do you think about it? Here's what it looked like in the previous agreed conclusions. Was that any better? And to get feedback on that was really valuable. So that's another way that you can engage in the agreed conclusions at this point without having to do an awful lot until we get to the next set of agreed conclusions. Then another thing that we were talking about earlier is mapping against the other commitments that Australia has made. And one of the things that you'll see as you start to dig into this is, gee, we say the same thing over and over again a lot of times in the international space. And so it's quite a good idea to line some of those up. And a lot of this work has already been done internationally. So you can Google to find your area and to start seeing who's identified the relevant human right and the relevant instrument that it comes from, who's identified the human rights treaty that modifies that right to make it focused on women and girls or more applicable to the population group you're dealing with. Where's the Human Rights Council resolution that puts a bit of flesh on it and pushes it a little bit further forward? Where does it line up under the Sustainable Development Goals? Where does it sit under COP or under LIMA, the Gender Action Plan on the Paris Agreement? If you're looking at a more specific area, say women and climate change, we've just had the release of the Gender Action Plan on the Sendai Framework for Disaster Response. And so having a look at what it is that you've got out there that reinforces what it is that Australia committed to do under the agreed conclusions, it's useful to have that under your belt, just as part of your sort of general knowledge of the area and your ability to be able to talk authoritatively about it. And then something else we talked about very briefly is identify the relevant levels of government or relevant departments and go and talk to them. If you're like me, somebody who goes and talks to the Department of Social Security about housing, go with the relevant paragraphs from the agreed conclusions and maybe the SDG, print it out. I do this periodically and it's always funny because the departments have a tendency to go, when you raise human rights in the context of domestic policy. So it would be really nice if in, say, 6 to 12 months' time, when I'm sitting down in front of a government department, somebody finally says, oh, yes, that one, we know about that one. At this point, I just take they know about it rather than we've actually done something about it. We can move on to doing something about it. But right now, it'd be great even if they just recognised that there were these international obligations and that when they implement domestic policy, they should have one eye on whether or not they're actually meeting what it is that we've committed to. That's also going to have a benefit for government, and it's worth pointing this out when you're talking to a department, that at some point, Office for Women's going to come knocking and say, there's a CSOs report due, what can you tell us? And if they've been mapping themselves, or if they've been using the materials, the mapping that you've done for them, it's much easier for them to be able to say, oh yeah, that program we did over there, that was relevant to the right to housing. And so it actually saves them work if they're thinking with a broad-based human rights framework when they set up policy to begin with. So you're actually doing them a favour too. So don't let them tell you to stop. The other thing you can do, and this comes back to another point Jael was making, is report to people about what the outcomes are. So tell your members, tell your networks, tell the people you work with what it is that we committed to, so that they can all themselves start to use that mapping and start to use that language. And then if you're really dedicated and you really think, yeah, there's an area that where we're making specific commitments, and one that springs to mind for me immediately is the right to privacy, which we don't technically have in Australia. We have a Privacy Act, but it doesn't give a right to privacy. What it does is sets out the rules for how you can handle information. Last year, we committed to a right to privacy. And that hasn't gone anywhere, but it's sitting there, and it's a very specific agreement by Australia that they will implement the right to privacy. And if you were working in that space, it would be worth you chasing that back through previous agreed conclusions to see whether or not that's appeared anywhere else. Now, you'll see back in the emails that I sent right back towards the beginning of them, it would have been 2 or 3, update 2 or 3, there's a link to a Dropbox which has all of the previous agreed conclusions on it. You can also find them on the UN Women website. But the nice thing about the Dropbox is they're all already there. You don't have to click through and then download different versions. And the way to go back in time is quite simply to take a little fragment of the text that you like from this year's agreed conclusions and whack it into the find function in a number of previous years. I often open up 4 or 5 at once and then just go Control F, paste, Control F, paste, and see whether it turned up anywhere else. And so I generally start with quite a longish phrase, and then I cut it down. So I might say, implement the right to privacy, might be the words that appeared last year. And I might find that in a couple of years and then go, yeah, that's not coming up. What about just privacy? And so I'll try that. I'll go, oh yeah, there was a weaker version 2 years earlier. Okay, so I'm seeing the progression. So that's the way to be able to start building an understanding of the history. That's not necessary unless you're in a space where you think that would be really useful. If you're someone who's really into the language negotiations and you've got a bit of time, it's a really useful exercise to do at this point in time before you forget all about it, before we get to the next cycle for language. And just copy and paste into a Word document and keep it for next time is my recommendation. Any questions at this point? Again, just come off mute. Okay. Well, I think at this point, actually, before we go on to this, I am just interested to do a bit of a check with anyone. We've heard from Jaya about what her report back is looking like and how she can see herself using the agreed conclusions. Anyone else got plans to be reporting to someone or using the agreed conclusions or anything else you picked up from CSW? Go, Ludmilla.
Hi, everybody. Yes, planning on doing a couple of debriefs, and I thank you, Helen, for getting us into this space to think about the connections, because that's what I've been thinking about as well a lot, including when we were in New York. I work in the women, peace and security space, and I was at this CSW on behalf of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILP. I'm also happen to be co-chair of another WPS organisation in Australia as well. So I'm already making my own internal organisational links, and I happen to be an international board member of WILP as well. So I've kind of like got my inbuilt debrief tri-level layers. And so soon after I came back from New York, I did a debrief on what happened in relation to the WPS agreements to our local WILF Australia group. And next week we've got a debrief across a global debrief with our WILF group. And we had members from across the globe at that meeting. And one of the things we're doing is looking at setting up, we have regional structures to articulate the various agreements and to look at constructing an advocacy strategy around what happened out of this CSW, but also into future CSWs. But I want to go back to what we said earlier, which I think one of the most powerful things for Australia is Australia has a Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan, which is due to provide its progress report any moment. Actually, it was due to provide the progress report any moment late last year, but it still hasn't. But one of the things that the civil society is engaged on doing is doing a shadow report of that progress report when it appears. And I think that using some of the conclusions from CSW is a useful way to cast that light, plus also matching that to what's come out of CEDAW, because there is a specific reference to WPS that Australia has to respond to with the next CEDAW report that needs to go in. Also this year, SDG 16 is being reviewed as part of the high level meeting. I think that takes place in June, July. So there's work there to connect. And then there are all these various other kinds of connections that we can make in relation to human rights issues, in relation to Beijing Plus 30, which I hope we'll go on to talk about in a little bit. So I'm working in our Asia Pacific region. I would love to hear more about what others are doing in the region as well, more broadly. And just so to reinforce this thinking laterally idea, gender and climate, gender and displacement, women and climate, women displacement, migration, trafficking, are all connected to the broader framework of understanding when we look at peace and security issues globally. So I think there's a number of ways of taking various bits and pieces out of various treaties and reconnecting them and actually presenting them to our government as a mirror, because there is a lot of siloing that goes on and a lot of potential ticking the box. We have a Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan, so we've done that bit. But what we haven't done is we haven't connected it to all these other aspects as well. So I would love to continue conversations with people who are also looking at that across their own areas of interest, thinking about how we make those broader ring connections and how we keep each other informed about this work that we're doing as well. Because I think we can build on each other's work too. So thanks, Helen.
There we go. Thanks for that, Ludmilla. And while we've got you, can you just tell us a little bit about the ways in which WILF in particular interfaces with DFAT on a number of these issues? Because just thinking about, for a lot of people on this call, you've got a domestic focus. It's tricky to be able to get the resourcing or the time to be able to think about building out. And yet WILF does a lot of work which relates directly to our local National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, but which then feeds into things like the Human Rights Council. And could you talk a little bit about that and about what WILF does?
I can, and I'll also reference the other organisation that WILF, along with a number of other NGOs and CSOs in Australia, is part of, and that's the Australian Civil Society Coalition on Women, Peace and Security, which I just happen to be co-chair of, along with being the Asia Pacific Regional Representative in WILF International. And I think that's one of the ways that we actually influence, in the sense of having people involved at multiple layers. That point about looking at home, looking nationally, looking regionally, and looking internationally is really important about reinforcing the messages. So WILF's actually 109 years old this month, and I actually feel quite a way along that 109 years today. That's another story, having just written the editorial for our newsletter about what a wonderful job everybody did at New York. But we have long worked in Australia as being one of the key CSOs, NGOs, to work to developing the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. Australia is now on its second National Action Plan. And it's a 10-year plan. And I won't go into belaboring all of these details, but the National Action Plan is a direct response to a Security Council resolution. So Australia's commitment in terms of National Action Plan ties directly to a Security Council resolution. So there is a lot of leverage to open up the space in terms of connecting to treaties. And I won't go into the multiple details of how that can be done, but it does mean that you have an option to engage in human rights, a legal authority, the Attorney General's work that in terms of all the treaties there, the gender and climate work through COP as well. And we basically lobby and advocate in the WPS space, but also in the demilitarization space, in the migration space. And that work gets fed into the broader Australian Civil Society Coalition, Women, Peace and Security, where we have a steering committee that represents that breadth of organisations in all those different areas. And we lobby in and engage with members locally as well as internationally. At the international level of the WILPF work that I do, next week we're having the second of our debriefs post CSW, where we're actually looking at so we told you what we did and who went there. We're now actually doing the planning for how do we move this forward this year. And perhaps just highlight what I think are the two major ways to move it forward and the major UN connections that we need to be really aware of. The first is the Summit of the Future, which is a major UN, as the Secretary General refers to it as a major review of the governance structures of the United Nations. And that's a fairly major understanding to undertake. And the first part of that is a CSO meeting in Nairobi in the first week of May, which is taking place. And I'm sorry, you can't sign up for it because everything closed to register during the time we were at CSW. But we have our Africa regional team going to that meeting in Nairobi. And then the actual meeting itself, the summit, as Helen's just put up there on the screen, takes place in September. So that's the first really important kind of connections where you can use the CSW findings to feed into, and you need to do that because the future of CSW itself is going to be one of the things that gets discussed at the Summit of the Future. The second really important carry on and connection through to CSW69 is the Beijing +30 work that needs to be done this year. And that gets done locally. Just tell me to shut up, Helen, if you were going to talk about all of this.
You're totally doing my job for me. Keep going.
That work gets done locally with a government report, which is due, my understanding is by about June, to ESCAP, United Nations ESCAP in Bangkok as Australia's regional hub. There is also, as we did for Beijing +25, a real opportunity for civil society to come together and put together our own equivalent of a shadow report on that, and then to consider participating in November in Bangkok at the UN ESCAP review of Beijing +30, because that's where the Asia Pacific's regional review report will be put together and submitted then to CSW69 to come up with the political statement that comes out of CSW69.
Yeah.
So WILPF will be participating in that. I would love to talk with other organisations who are going to be working at that Asia Pacific regional level, trying to coordinate. I think the Women's Rights Caucus is going to be quite active in that as well. But the importance is to reproduce this across all the regions, Asia Pacific for us, but again, our Africa group is going to be very active in this at the WILPF international level. And all of this, because ours is a global organisation, but it's the model, I think, that counts more than whether you're global or national or local, is the sense of trying to bring the different layers of all understanding and ideas together so that you can draw from that information, from those connections, what is relevant to you to then utilise in lobbying for your own kind of context. So you might have noticed that our Minister for Defence made a fairly major pronouncement a couple of days back on the $50+ billion that will be spent over the next 10 years financing the Australian Defence Force and military structures, as well as new manufacturing opportunities in Australia. I think there's a whole lot of ways that people can think about making connections across different kinds of policy alignments. So when we talk about women, peace and security, it's not just about the women part, it's about the peace part and it's about the security part, but it's also about climate. It's also about migration and refugees. It's also about where is our money being spent in terms of the prioritisation for our country. So my problem is I see too many connections.
And look,
I've never had a problem with connections. Also, the issue is the alignment of policy in Australia, and how do we use that as a mirror for government, but also an opportunity to really take on seriously this issue of accountability.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the big missing piece here in Australia is, where's the national gender equality strategy on this stuff?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's something that let's come on to that, actually, because I think that's quite a critical one in terms of the feedback that we gave to the government originally, which was that we wanted to see a human rights framework for the national strategy, and we don't have it. And so it's up to us to actually do that mapping. And I think that's a critical piece of work that's ahead of us. So thanks. That was fantastic. And you've done quite a big bit of my next job. So this is really good. And I think if you're sitting here listening to Ludmilla talk about that and going, oh my God, we don't have the time or the resourcing or frankly the brain space to be able to do any of that, that's okay. Because some of us are sitting more in a space where the mechanisms that we work through sit in those international spaces. Some of us are sitting very firmly in the domestic, asking, what is it that the international can bring as a value add to my work? And both those positions are perfectly valid. And being in the domestic space and simply incorporating the international stuff into your work is critically important, because what it does is bring the general level of knowledge up, both within your organisation, but also in every organisation that you then interact with where you raise these issues. And so there are different levels of engagement here. And one of the things I would like to see, particularly out of this group that we built at CSW this year, is that capacity that Ludmilla's talking about to exchange information about what everybody's doing, to do a little bit of digesting for each other. So that it's not necessary for everybody to read the outcomes of the Summit of the Future, but that everybody will have a pretty good idea of what was in it and which bits of it are relevant to their work. Same with CSW69 and Beijing +30. It's not necessary for all of us to be there in Bangkok, but it is necessary for the people in Bangkok to have access to a range of people that they can talk to. So that, similar to the language work that we do at CSW, there's a flow through from Australia into that process. And so the voices are actually getting heard. So let's just add a little bit more detail to CSW69, which is the anniversary year, Beijing +30. That's what we mean when we say Beijing +30. We're saying it's 30 years since the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995. So as we were saying, it's a review year, and that means no agreed conclusions next year. Instead, they have a political declaration, which is generally a 2-page document, which is pretty anodyne. Doesn't say a lot. Often says we've done much, but we need to do more, and it's very urgent, and a time of crisis is upon us. That's pretty much it. You could write it off the top of your head most years. This time around, there will be quite a lot of politics around it, just because of the sort of permacrisis environment we're in. But it's not something where we spend a lot of energy on the political declaration. The places that the energy really needs to go are into those regional processes that Ludmilla was talking about. And that's a place where we traditionally are very patchy. There are some people who are really good on this stuff, and I highly recommend Carol Shaw, Ludmilla, and a few other key people from our network who work in those spaces. But the rest of us don't do a lot of engagement in that space, myself included. And so that's something that I would like to see change. I would like to see us have more of a Pacific and Asia Pacific focus around our human rights interactions. So as Ludmilla was mentioning, there is this regional process which produces a report that goes to CSW69 about the progress across our region. And feeding into that is a report by Australia. And as Ludmilla says, that's due anytime now. So June-ish, I think we're looking at June or July. And not heard a lot about that. So we're going to chase that up with Office for Women, and I'll let you know where that's sitting. But last time around, the Australian government funded the production of a shadow report to the Beijing process. And we haven't heard anything about that this time. So that's another thing for us to chase up. And that looks a lot like treaty reporting processes, except that it's very freewheeling. We get a lot of scope to say what it is that we want to focus on, because the framework for that report is fairly broad. So it's that in turn makes it a huge job to bring that together, and it really does need to be a funded piece of work. So we need to start those conversations with Office for Women pretty quickly about what that process looks like. That's the sort of thing that we might then bring back to this group and say, okay, somebody has put up their hand to take that funding and do the work. Let's now bring this group in and have everybody contribute their little bit to that report and see if we can produce something strong. And that's pretty much the process that we're also using in relation to the CSOs report. So it's time for CSOs country report, time for Australia's country report under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Our report's due in July or August this year. It's been 7 years since our last one, so it's got to cover a lot of ground. For those of you who are interested in this, we are preparing a shadow report. And in fact, we're contributing to a National Women's Alliance shadow report. And then we are also looking at pulling together a second report for organisations that don't traditionally participate within the Alliance structure. And because there are a number of particular holes in the Alliance coverage. And so there are 2 shadow reports underway that ERA is involved in. And what we're going to do is pull all the information into one place and then give the bit that's relevant to the National Women's Alliance's shadow report to their writer. And then everything else goes into ours. Shadow reports are extremely tight. We've got 6,600 words for the report. That includes the footnotes. And we have, 26 issues that need to be addressed. So anyone who's interested in that process, we did a training video on this on Tuesday, and that training video will be available on our website next week. So open that up. The other thing to know is that we held a consultation workshop yesterday. There will be another one next Tuesday for young women under 30, so 30 and under. So anyone you know who might be interested in that process, feel free to get them to drop Maddie or I a line, and we'll get them a link to that consultation. There is a survey. There are in fact 2 surveys out. One's a sort of quick and dirty, simple one, where you just chuck in anything that you want to tell the committee, the CSOs committee, under the process. The other one actually breaks down the list of issues that Australia has to respond to and steps you through each of the issues. And you can look at them and go, yep, that one's not me, that one's not me, that one's, oh, I've got something to say here. and put it in, and they go, not me, yes, me. And so that survey, if you're somebody who's got materials, reports, and so on, that's the one you might want to be looking at, because you might want to be lining up what you're saying quite specifically with what it is the committee's asking. So links to those 2 surveys are going to be sent around to everybody who is involved in CSW. Do feel free to get involved in that. And if you've got any questions or need any more information, get in contact with Maddie or I about that. We need that shadow report done by the 30th of June, which is looming. So we're looking for feedback by the 9th of May, because it's going to be a very large editing job to get it down to roughly 250 words per headline issue, which is kind of scary. Ludmilla also talked about the Summit of the Future. So there are details of that sitting there. I think this is one of those areas where, again, what we need to be doing is producing a bit of a digest of what comes out of that, and compiling opportunities for getting involved. So ERA, for example, has already written one submission on shrinking civil society space. Just in passing, I read something interesting last night about the use of the phrase shrinking civil society space. And the person was saying that suggests that it's, something that is happening organically rather than a squeeze. And they prefer the phrase squeezing of civil society space. So I'm going to try and use that language from now on. I think it's great. So some of the future, another piece for us to look out for, because as Ludmilla says, they're going to consider what CSW looks like. They're going to consider the whole structure of the UN, and in the context we're in, that's a quite interesting space given the pushback on the UN. Maddie, is there anything that I haven't covered on that? Because I've just gone riding roughshod over an area that you were going to cover. So anything you want to add?
Yes, probably. Let's just swap over our speakers so we don't get feedback. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, brilliant. Hello, by the way.
But actually, we are getting an echo. We're getting an echo, Helen. Helen, it's not.
You're shaking your head. Can everyone else hear me? No? Okay. Okay. 1 minute. Okay.
We're getting an echo, Maddie.
Yes. Can't see reactions.
Can people hear Maddie? Yeah, shake or no?
Now you've gone a little bit echoey, Helen.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there's an echo.
Sorry, could you repeat that for us, Jill?
Oh, no.
Okay, how's this?
That's better.
Okay, brilliant. All right. Apologies about that. We're just in the same room. So occasionally technical difficulties when we switch over our mics. But I was just saying, it is very lovely to see those of you who I didn't see in our first session this morning. And very quickly, thank you to Ludmilla for providing that an initial overview of the Summit of the Future for us. It's a nice reminder that this is an important thing that we should all be watching. So just very quickly, because we already have a bit of an overview, I just want to draw people's attention to the fact that we do already have a zero draft document for the Pact of the Future, which is the document that's going to come out of that process. And I'm just sharing that in the chat now, a link to that. A couple of things to be aware of in that document. So it does include a reaffirmed commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals and financing for development. So very much a continuation of some of the conversations we've had around CSW, also relevant to the conversation that we had in our first session today about young women and young people. There is actually a youth and future generations section in Pact for the Future. So if that girls language was something you're interested in, I would have a look at that as well. Finally, there's also an outer space section at the end. So if that gets you to read the document, that's kind of interesting. I think that's probably all that I would add on Summit for the Future that we haven't already talked about. So I'm just going to pass it back over to Helen now.
Which involves careful manipulation of the tech. How did we do? Can people hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Helen.
Yay! Oh, we are so on this. All right. So other things.
Yeah.
Cool. Other things that are coming up in the longer term, but it might be worth keeping in the back of your head, particularly if you're an organisation that does your strategic planning from financial year to financial year. Keep in mind that the CDOR hearing for Australia is likely to take place at some time. Technically June 2025, but the liquidity crisis is affecting Geneva as well. And so who knows, watch this space. We'll let you know when we hear anything concrete, but right now Australia doesn't know either. The other thing to keep an eye on is the election of the CDOR committee. As you know, Natasha Stott-Despoja is up for re-election, so keep an eye out to see whether or not we keep that useful ally on the committee. At that hearing, there are opportunities for NGOs to get involved in the process. There are two key opportunities. The first is what's called the informal hearing, which is where the committee sits down with NGOs and they are given 10 minutes per country to talk to the committee about the issues. And so there's a process whereby international NGOs and Australian NGOs need to negotiate how you split that 10 minutes, whether you all contribute to a single statement or whether somebody gets 2 minutes over here, or how that works. And so if you're interested in that, particularly if the people who would be most interested in that are people who can look at, say, the last two sets of concluding observations from CDOR and see that there is a recommendation in both of them that has not been addressed, being able to say, look, this has been hanging for ages and Australia hasn't done anything about it, is a really useful point for you to then go into that Geneva process. There are a couple of ways to do that. And one of them is for us to line you up with an international organisation. So, for example, YWCA has World YWCA in Geneva. And so we have in the past organised for someone from World YWCA to go and deliver a statement on behalf of Australian NGOs. So if people are interested in that, get in contact with me. We are going to circulate information about CDOR on an ongoing basis once we've got the shadow report sorted. So you'll be able to signal your interest through those platforms. Generation equality is still out there and bobbing. So this are the commitments that were made in the generation equality process back in 2021. The point organisation for that in Australia is IWDA, International Women's Development Agency. And so we will feed through information that we receive from them about that process. It's also worth being aware that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Civil and Political Rights, that should be social and political rights, and social and cultural rights. That's wrong on so many levels. Sorry, guys. And the Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights are all probably due to have reports soon. We haven't heard anything formal about any of them yet, although CRC should be pretty soon. So it might simply be that we're out of the loop on that one and need to get back into it. But those three, I think, Convention on the Rights of the Child and I think the Convention on the Rights of the Child and ISCA are both from, say, 2017 or 18. And then the Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights, the last one was 2020, and they're all 4-year cycles. So we should really be seeing Australian reports on those soon. It's been, was it 2017 that Australia last reported, made a voluntary country report under the Sustainable Development Goals. So we haven't actually reported on our progress under the SDGs in quite some time. So it's probably time for us to be doing that. And then it's worth just being aware, when you want to get your head around the whole structure of where this work happens, there are two other pieces that we don't get a lot involved in the women's sector, but which do deal with gender equality. And one of those is the Human Rights Council meetings. And those meetings tend to happen 3 times a year, in February, March, June, July, and September, October. And they're 4-week meetings, so they're big, chunky things. And the Human Rights Council produces resolutions, and it produces a range of discussions and technical documents, which are all really useful for considering specific issues, and particularly the evolution of human rights and our understanding of those human rights. They also take country reports and complaints and concerns about human rights globally. But then some of those issues, if they're coming through the General Assembly rather than through the Human Rights Council, will actually go to something called the UNGA Third Committee. So the UNGA, UN General Assembly Third Committee. This is basically a sort of subcommittee of the UN General Assembly, where they send all the human rights stuff, all the social and global equality type work goes to the Third Committee. And so knowing that the Human Rights Council and the Third Committee are sitting there also doing work in this space is an important thing to keep in the back of your head, because every now and then you may be asked to give some input into those processes. They're both run through DFAT. Or you might be asked, you might realise that there's an opportunity for you to pursue something. And that's particularly the case if you're dealing with marginalised populations in your work, because the Human Rights Council and the Third Committee are the sort of places where we start to get an examination of that more cutting edge stuff around intersectionality and around what it's like to be marginalised but unrecognised and invisible within human rights systems. So if you're in those spaces, this is a useful place for you to start thinking about. And then I should say, before we go on from there, are there any other international processes that people would like to call to our attention, just to sort of have on our blackboard in the back of our heads? Anything anyone would like to raise?
One thing I'd like to raise, Helen, is that something that has happened recently is the People's Health Movement. So they are an international organization that look at equality in health and how one can fight forces of capitalism in some ways. So they have just finished their deliberations in Argentina, and I've been keeping not exactly on top of it, but I've been informed about those, and there will be a document, and I'll share that with you. So that's something called the People's Health Movement. That's a really large movement across countries in looking at equitable access to health across the board. So that's another one that has happened now, just in April 2024.
I need a t-shirt that just says, I'm on mute. That would be great, Jaya, if we could get that circulated. And that would be really helpful, generally speaking. If you're following a particular process, to sort of put your hand up in the group and say, I'm in this one. Anyone else doing work on this? And if not, I'll start feeding stuff through to you so that people can see stuff go by and pick the bits that are useful for them to use.
And the other piece was on COP28, where the whole climate action was held in UAE, in Dubai, and that happened. So that document has come out. It is also lukewarm and not as impactful as was needed in some ways, but it was very much controlled by the oil manufacturing countries in some ways, and developed countries. So that is there. And there was another thing that happened. Normally we have the World Economic Forum, and there's always fewer representation of women leaders in that. There's fewer representation of women corporate leaders. So women political leaders as well as women corporate leaders. So that these are things that have happened in recent times, in the last 3 or 4 months, that also feed into what we are talking about. But what I wanted to ask, Helen, is you made a mention about Bangkok. What's happening in Bangkok? Which of the meets are happening in Bangkok and when?
So it's the meeting of the regional, oh, and I'm going to get the name wrong, and Carol is going to email me because I should get it.
UNSCAP,
She told me. But sorry, go ahead.
SCAP, UN
It's the
SCAP.
SCAP meeting. Thank you. Which is so SCAP is the body that the UN uses to coordinate the regional involvement in CSW. And so what happened, that's the process I was talking about, where we're going to produce a regional report for the review year for CSW. So the Bangkok meeting is a meeting at the SCAP headquarters in Bangkok, where the people who are working on country reports or alliance reports from the region come together to have input into the report that goes from the Asia Pacific region into CSW69. And so the Bangkok process happens in November, much, much earlier than CSW. So in review years, you kind of have to gear up to do CSW much earlier. The good news is it's a lot cheaper. It's not New York. And so for us, the travel isn't so hard either. And so we would be hoping to have some sort of Australian group there. Once again, the Australian government has assisted Australian NGOs to be involved in that process. There's usually a CSO process in Bangkok and a government process. And Australia has been good at getting us some insight into the government process and of having a feed through into the government process negotiation in a similar way to the way we handle the agreed conclusions. And so we haven't had any conversations with Office for Women yet about what Bangkok might look like, or even about what producing an Australian report might look like. But that process is all still sitting there. So when we talk about Bangkok, we're talking about Beijing +30 and CSW69.
We also have a question from Lee.
Cool. Question from Lee. Go, Lee.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. No, it wasn't a question. It was just a comment more the way we operate. Just wondering how we can feed more information through from the international that will give you more details. Because we have our own SI UN representatives at 7 of the different UN centres, we have one of our UN reps in Geneva that's actually on the CEDAW committee. So if we want reports beforehand, she's offered to me, she said it was a lot of work, but she can pull the reports for Australia, for example, beforehand. So I'm wondering if things like that I can actually facilitate for us here in Australia.
Sounds brilliant.
And I was just talking to one of our UN reps this morning, and she's quite into human trafficking, and she's just sent me the latest report
opposing human trafficking.
But yes, sorry.
Sorry.
I'm just opening my phone so I can just speak specifically to what she's just sent me the report on. It's the NGO. Sorry, I've just got to open it out. The NGO Committee to Stop Trafficking in Persons, and they've got a report on diminishing the prevalence of human trafficking pilot project. So there are quite specific things. A lot of our UN reps get involved with all of the UN meetings that are relevant to women and girls, that I can pull some of their latest reports for any of the groups if they wish to, or how I can do this, if it's worthwhile sending it on to you or not necessarily.
Definitely. And that's a generalized invitation too. If stuff comes across your desk, there's no harm in flicking it to us. If we're snowed, we might not be able to deal with it, but at least the option is there if we've got capacity to do it. Also, what we're planning to do, and Maddie will talk about this a bit more shortly, but we're planning to have roll the email group over into a new iteration. Ordinarily we would do that sort of in September, October, but I would like us to do it now and to make that an international engagement email list rather than a CSW specific email list. So we will start using that list to talk to people about CEDAW, for example, immediately, and about the Beijing +30 process immediately. So that I think that's a sort of mechanism for us to use. And at that point, we may, the WhatsApp groups, worked quite nicely, I think.
Yes,
And I think it might be worth us keeping a WhatsApp group running. People can, disable the notifications on it if it's something that they only want to dip into occasionally. But it is a useful place to just post something and say, here's a link to the report that I've just seen. And so that there is this little bit of a rolling resource.
Yes, because we also we have 26 UN representatives, but 2 of those are specific youth representatives that we've only appointed this year. One of them is in Nairobi, which I just mentioned to Ludmilla, but one of them is, and she's only about 23, but she's really involved with all of the environmental program from Nairobi. And the other one is in New York. So they're quite specific. It only happens to be because we came across the youth advertising for other UN reps, and these 2 applied, that we've actually brought them on board as specific youth representatives, so they can be quite valuable to us as well.
Fantastic. That sounds great. For those who are interested in the climate space too, particularly if you are dealing with issues around climate response and poverty in Australia, and I know that a lot of people here are in different manifestations, keeping an eye on the Women's Majors group, which is the NGO group, the international NGO group that operates around the COP process and the Paris Agreement. That's a useful place to get information as well. And membership of the Women's Majors group is open, so you can apply to join that if you qualify. So worth thinking about that one too, the Women's Majors group.
Is that the one in New York?
Yes. Well, there's kind of
there's quite a few.
Yeah.
There's in Nairobi as well. The one in New York, we're actually Sir Optimus is the operational manager, or whatever position they call it, through our UN reps there in New York at the moment, the Women's Major group.
So the Women's Majors group is an international grouping that operates largely online, but does get together occasionally. So that's if that's an area of interest, then be aware of that one. I'll just take us across, we're coming close to our time, so I'm going to take us across to a couple of things that are coming up in Australia that I think it's going to be really critically important for us to be aware of. So this is where, if you like, we've started at the domestic, moved ourselves into CSW, and now we're arcing back down through, let's bring CSW back to Australia to, oh, look, here's the human rights stuff that's about to land on us here in Australia. And so you are all almost uniquely positioned in relation to this, because you're thinking about human rights a lot more than many of the people who'll be working in these processes already are. So the first one is that the report of the Joint Standing Committee on Human Rights, their inquiry into Australia's human rights framework, is due at the end of May. That's an extension. It was actually due at the end of March, so we should have seen it by now. So interesting that it sounds like it might be quite a chunky response. That framework that they're referring to there is the framework that we have, which set up that Joint Standing Committee, and also there's another slide fail. That's not a Joint Standing Committee, it's a Joint Parliamentary Committee. Apologies, everyone. My editing brain's clearly not working. The Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights was set up as part of that framework, along with an education piece and some tweaking to our anti-discrimination acts. But it's a framework that doesn't include an Australian Bill or Charter of Human Rights. And so one big question that's going to come out of that report is, should we be developing an Australian Human Rights Act, Human Rights Charter, something that looks like that? And that's going to have major impact for the implementation of things like CEDAW, for CSW. It's going to provide a federal framework for the work that we're all trying to piece together here. And so that's a discussion that we really need to be involved in, particularly since there is a real risk that if people think a Human Rights Act is a hard thing to do, then the likelihood is they're going to just do the big headline rights that tend to influence people's lives in really critical ways, and I'm thinking specifically of the civil and political rights, but see less of the economic, social, and cultural rights, which are the ones that affect women's lives on a much more regular day-to-day basis, and are the places where patriarchy is most firmly embedded, where we see most of the barriers to gender equality in Australia. So having us get involved in that discussion about a Charter of Human Rights is going to be really quite critical over the next 12 months. The other one to keep an eye on is that the Australian Law Reform Commission made a report into religious educational institutions and anti-discrimination laws. And this is a response to the debacle that was the religious discrimination bill in 2021. It was an awful bill which threatened to wind back significant parts of the Sex Discrimination Act to make it perfectly acceptable for religious entities to discriminate against women on the basis that we were somehow embedding a human right into those, in some cases, corporate entities. So it was a mess, a total dog's breakfast. Justice Lee would refer to it as an omnishambles, and he would be right. And it led to this inquiry in the Australian Law Reform Commission about exactly what the scope of a religious discrimination protection should be in Australia and how it should interact with education and with the other discrimination acts. And what's important about that report is that there is a firm recommendation that the Sex Discrimination Act should not be wound back in order to implement a religious discrimination right. That's going to be controversial. So we're waiting to see a bill about protection for religious discrimination. It's obviously critically important that we have that protection in Australia, and we strongly endorse having a bill, but it's got to be a bill that carefully balances the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and belief against the rights of women and girls. And so watching that discussion is going to also be quite critical over probably the next 6 months. Jaya, what did you want to add there? Sorry, saw your hand. Nope, good. Anyone else want to add anything on any of that? Or
because we can't see anyone. We can only see you and the slide.
Yep, okay, that's fine. No one else matters. It's just me, Jaya. Sorry.
But I have to go. I have to finish soon. Are you finishing soon, Helen?
We're just about to wrap up. So I'd like to hand over to Maddie now for next steps. All right, over to you, Maddie.
Thank you, Helen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear me again this time. I can see everyone else. If you can either nod or do a thumbs up, that would be very helpful. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Lee. So because we're reaching the end of our time, I'm going to try and get fairly quickly through next steps. Luckily, we've already covered most of it. But just as a reminder, so for us, our next steps are working on CDAW. So if you didn't manage to make it to our initial CDAW consultation and you're not one of the people who's going to be coming to our Young Women's consultation for CDAW on Tuesday, please do have a look at those surveys. It's incredibly helpful to us in working out what we need to prioritise in writing those shadow reports, and we'll redistribute links to those as well. If you have a bunch of stuff on one particular issue and you don't have the time to go through the survey, you can also email us directly or set up a time to talk to us. We're equally happy to do that, and that would be much appreciated. We also are going to have a feedback survey for CSW68 that we're going to distribute. So please do keep an eye out for that. We have had a couple of people ask us what they can do to support us in our work coming away from CSW68, and this is the thing that you can do. That would be really wonderful. So if you do one thing in supporting us in our work and keeping that going, filling out the survey and letting us know what was helpful to you would be massively helpful in terms of writing our report back to government. So if you have time, we would love it if you could spend some time doing that. We've already talked about Beijing Plus 30, but do make sure that you're part of our email list so you keep getting the updates for that. We're going to keep those WhatsApp groups live, as Helen has said. Do feel free to opt out of those or turn off notifications, but that's the space where if we've sent something out and it's a big block of text, I will be in those WhatsApp groups saying, hey guys, this is the one thing that you need to remember from that email. So if that's a useful tool, those will still be there, and I will keep updating them and being active in those groups. I think that's everything that we needed to tell everyone for now. Helen, unless there's anything else. Okay. Yes. Okay. Helen has just helpfully reminded me. If you have notes from the CSW68 debriefs, please do send them to us because that's also really helpful, both for our internal reporting and also for reporting back to government, particularly as we keep having those conversations about what CSO engagement will look like in the next couple of years. It's massively, massively helpful. And thank you for making the time today to start that process with us. We really do appreciate it. We know it's a big commitment. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Any questions or comments on any of those next steps that I've just mentioned?
No, thank you for all the work you and Helen are doing. And I have to leave now. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Jaya.
Maddie, can I just mention something with CDOR? Something Seroptimist International has been collaborating with another organisation, Every Woman Treaty, to have an international treaty to stop violence against women. And we're at a stage that at CSW, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women made an announcement that her and her predecessors agree that that should happen. So we've been working with the CSOs committee in Geneva, and it looks like we want to do the optional protocol to CSOs to specifically to stop violence against women in that optional protocol. And we have 4 countries now that have gone forward to say yes, they will support that. Now we're in a stage of where we want more countries to start working towards that. And at CHOGM, so the Commonwealth Heads of Government will be held in Samoa in September this year. And in CSW, I met with the Commonwealth, and we're doing a side event to try and get the Commonwealth countries to support that as well, to have the optional protocol, and it'll be based on Resolution 35 in CSW.
Just to clarify, what countries did you say were already involved in that process?
There's Costa Rica. I'll put it on the WhatsApp group because I haven't got them there. Costa Rica is one. I'll put it on because it's just gone from my mind right at this moment. But there are 4 countries that have already put their hand up to say yes, they would support that. So we do want more, and of course work with Australia as well in that manner. But I can give you more of a paper specifically on it and what's happened at CSW this year. But we've been working on it for 2 years with Every Woman Treaty, another organisation of activists that are based on the medical women, the international medical women. They're human rights activists around the country. There's 3,000 or 4,000 of them in that organisation pushing to stop violence against women. So I'll do a little paper on it and sort of send it in to you.
Okay, thank you. No, we would really appreciate that. And then we can, as you said, distribute that to the WhatsApp group. For anyone else who's listening who wants to know more about that, we can get that information out.
Because the more that we know about it, that if anyone has the opportunity of supporting it to our government, no matter where it comes from, it's like, hey, put your hand up, put it forward. We want this optional protocol to CSOs, which is a treaty within its own right, but to stop violence against women.
I think Helen wants to add something to that, so I'm just going to turn my microphone off quickly so you can jump back in, Helen.
Well, there we go. Correct. Another, that's great, Lee, because that's one of those processes that I think is going to boil on. And if we can get in kind of at this point before Australia's really committed to a position, that's quite useful. Yes. The other one that's floating around that we'll distribute some information about is that there was a process at last CSW of starting a campaign about the squeeze on the CSO space, particularly at CSW. And it was Costa Rica and I can't remember the other state, but a couple of states have actually sponsored a resolution, I think it is. There's a process underway anyway, which is looking at that squeezing of space. And there's a survey out at the moment where they're asking for people's responses in relation to that squeeze. So we will distribute the link for that survey for people to be able to circulate that.
Because Costa Rica is quite forward thinking, and I've heard Fiji is in the last few years as well, pushing for this type of thing for women and girls. So we could have, particularly in our region, a few countries, if we can get Australia on board and Fiji and a few others, some of the Commonwealth countries might come on board to support either or both of those.
Yeah, and just confirming, it was Costa Rica and Denmark, and the project is called Unmute, UN Mute.
Oh, Unmute, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
The last couple of CSWs.
Yeah, so it's actually picking up, and so we'll distribute the link for people to be able to contribute to that.
Oh, excellent. I am aware of that one, but I haven't gone into it, Helen, so
Fantastic.
I'm just looking to see.
All right, well, we might wrap it up. I just want to say we've only got a few people left with us, but lots of people will be watching this subsequently. This CSW was a success because you all committed time and energy to it. And because when you did commit that time and energy, you did so with such generosity and such sort of intelligence, I think. And so I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. You made such a difference to the process. We got language into that document, and at one point we might try and get International Women's Development Agency to send us around a little brief about the language that we got through. There was language in other places where we made direct recommendations, for example, around menstrual health, and that language got through. So we actually made an impact. And I think a key part of that was that you were all involved in backing the sort of key people who ordinarily do this work, both in government and outside. So having you there was valuable, and it made a difference. So thank you to all of you. And let's see what the next stage is.
And thank you to you, Helen, for driving and your inspiration.
Thanks, Lee.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks,
I
everybody.
need to contact you about the 1st of May. What's best, email or WhatsApp or phone?
Email at the moment. I'm hard to get.
Okay. Thanks.
Cheers,
I'll do
everyone.
that over the weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
See you.
you.